This is Avis Carol Walton speaking to you from Nelson, British Columbia. This is my very first trip to Nelson, and it is something that I have wanted to do ever since I was a little girl, because my father, Charlie Gray, came here when he was a young man, in fact, a youth of only 17. Now, my father ran away to sea in a pilot cutter in North Wales when he was 13. His family got him back, and he continued his education at Dulwich College in East Dulwich in the city of London. This is a rather famous old college, and Sir Ernest Shackleton went to school there at about the same time, I believe. My father was always very interested in adventure, high adventure and a crown. And he wanted to come out to see this country, to see Australia and see the world. And his family finally apprenticed him to a sailing ship, the Arunzi, in 1894. And in February of 1894, he went off to sea from Tilbury Dock, sailed out to Australia, and then on and around the Horn. And he did this 3 times. He circumnavigated the globe, taking the same course which Drake took around the globe. And they traded in wool, they carried lumber, they carried all sorts of things, and in their final voyage, the Arunzi had on board a load of dynamite. There was a mystery involved in this particular voyage, which has never been entirely cleared up, because the captain was criticized for leaving the ship. However, the rudder carried away, and on January the 25th, 1897, they took to the open boats. They were picked up by the Port Douglas by a Shanghaied Portuguese crew and taken to Ireland. From Ireland, they went over to Scotland and came down by train to London, and my father had just enough money to take a bus or transportation of some kind to Herne Hill. From there he walked home, and when he went and knocked on the door, his cousin Herbert answered the door, and he said, "My God, Charlie, we thought you were dead." And his mother, who was Scottish, called down from upstairs, "My laddie, my laddie." And he went running upstairs, and then he steered a course to the pantry and had some cookies and things to eat. And then, a little while after this, his sister came home from New York, and she insisted that Charlie leave the sea and come out to the North American continent. So he sailed steerage, and he slept in the straw, he arrived at Ellis Island with 17 shillings in his pocket, and from there he came to Nelson in 1897, and he worked at the smelter in Nelson. He also did some sort of line work and power work with the telephone company here at that time. And his first cabin here, the first place he lived in Nelson, was a little shack 12 by 14. And he had a couple of dogs, and after a while the dogs had puppies, and so there were the 2 dogs and 7 pups. And I remember one of the names he gave the pups was Cassie Von Born. There was a man named Von Born associated with their work. And there was a dog called Hip Chung Wilson. Wilson was one of their friends. And he had a partner come and stay with him. His name was Jimmy Miller. And Jimmy Miller was a brother of a rather famous British entertainer, music hall entertainer at that time. Her name was Gertie Miller. And I remember many years later, when Daddy was back in London, he sent a note backstage after seeing her perform. He sent a note backstage to Gertie Miller, and on it he said, "I am a friend of your brother's, and I would like to come backstage and see you." She sent back a note saying, "I am not interested in meeting any friend of my brother's." I expect her family considered it rather disgraceful that he had come out to Canada and worked at various jobs in the colonies. In any case, my father never did meet Gertie Miller. But he worked here for some time, and he was young and strong, and he loved this country very much. He liked the fishing and the hunting and the beautiful scenery, the magnificent mountain streams, and all the things which I can see here now, even as I look out the window of Mr. Fleming's studio here. I can see lovely trees and mountains and houses nestled here, which, of course, were in the main not here in 1897. However, he went back to New York, and he became interested in electricity. And he did a great variety of electrical jobs, including driving the first electric taxi cabs in New York. And one adventure which he had was rather a strange one. He picked up a passenger when he got to the end of the run and opened the door and asked them to get out. The person didn't move. His passenger had died en route. And he drove many of the celebrities of New York, because in those days there were not very many taxi cabs powered by electricity. This was something new and rather interesting. And he worked in department stores, looking after their arc lamps. He worked for the Sprague Electric Company and helped to install the first electric elevators in the first Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, which of course has since been torn down, and a newer and more modern building has gone up in its place. He did many electrical jobs, and then he returned out to this part of the country, and he worked at Bonnington Falls under L.A. Campbell. And when he was working at Bonnington Falls, according to his records here, which were taken from some of the letters that he wrote for application for other jobs, he was with the West Kootenay Light and Power and was engineer in charge of the plant operating hydraulic and electrical equipment, upkeep of 20,000 volts transmission line, which ran from Bonnington Falls outside Nelson to Rossland. And while he was engineer in charge of this plant, there were some very wonderful people came and worked with him. For example, there was George Leacock. Now, George Leacock was a brother of the famous Stephen Leacock. And Stephen Leacock was one of a very big family. And every time he wrote a book or an article, they all claimed that these books and articles were all full of the family jokes, which was quite true. They all had this same zany sense of humor. And one day, when Stephen had published a new book, he sent a copy to George. George received it, and on the flyleaf was written, "Dear George, at last I have written a book without one of your jokes in it." So George said, "Come on, Charlie," and they went down to the telegraph office, and he sent off a wire which said, "Dear Stephen, I have read your book and believe you." Stephen, George Leacock, and my father, Jack Cornwall, a chap named Hunt, they used to go swimming in the nude at the pool below Bonnington Falls, and they developed quite a good tan. And my father and George Leacock painted themselves not with woad in the ancient British tradition, but with fluorescent paint, and they painted the outlines of their own skeletons on their bodies, and then they went out and they danced in front of the headlights of the train as the train came by, and they had a lot of fun doing this. I've often wondered if this might not be one of the sources of some of the legends of strange spirits and Sasquatch in this area. Then they went on rafts and they went hunting, and my father wrote an article which appeared in Field and Stream in 1903. He called it Trail Cutting Through the Rockies, and the path which they took went from Kootenay Lake through Pilot Bay, way up over the mountains, and his descriptions of it were quite rugged. They were about 6 or 8 weeks cutting trail under a major ascot. And when they went through St. Mary's River, or St. Mary's Lake it is perhaps, around that area, and wound up at Fort Steele. Now, I am not sure whether this trail cutting job was done while he was with the West Kootenay Light and Power, or whether this was something to do with telephone lines. But he did this, and he had one adventure while cutting trail. He rather foolishly shot a bear, and he didn't have a very big gun, and the bear was only irritated and wounded, and the bear came at him, and he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do next when out of the bush appeared an old hermit, and he just took one shot at the bear and killed him. And this was a man who I believe was a rather well-known hermit in these parts in those days. And later on, my father left here and he went back to New York. He worked with the electrification and with the Westinghouse there on the Interborough Rapid Transit work. These would be the overhead electric tramways. And then from there he went to London for the Westinghouse and helped with the electrification of the Underground Railroad there when they transferred from steam to electricity. Later on, he went back to the North American continent and he became the chief of erection for the Canadian Westinghouse for the Dominion of Canada. And he was the superintendent of construction, and he had charge of the installation of the company's apparatus at many plants, including apparatus which was purchased and put in at the West Kootenay Light and Power. So he came back here to this country for a third time. Later, he left here, and his final work for the Westinghouse was with the Canadian Westinghouse in Winnipeg, when he put in the Winnipeg's hydroelectric plant at Point du Bois. That is, he put in the Westinghouse apparatus at this plant and had charge of the installation of the apparatus in their various substations and operated this apparatus till a system was turned over to the city of Winnipeg. Now, one of the things which my father did when he had men working with him with electricity, having been at sea, his flow of language was sometimes rather colourful, but he would swear at his men, and he would say, by blankety blank, 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 if you do not treat every bit of wire and every bit of apparatus as though it is alive, I will jolly well do this and that and so on. And he was a man, a very good-looking man. He had hazel brown eyes which seemed to take fire when he got angry. He had chestnut curly hair. He wasn't very big. He had a beautiful speaking voice, rather like Ronald Colman, which is the voice of an Englishman who's lived on the North American continent for many years. And the thing, he was a leader of men. He managed to impress upon them to be very careful. He had very few accidents, and he was very proud of the fact that in the 3 years when he was putting in the power in the city of Winnipeg, he never lost a man. But in the 6 months after he turned the 8 substations and the main power station over to the city, there were something like 2 or 3 men killed because they did not treat every bit of equipment as though it were alive, whether they knew that it were alive or not. And he had an experience which I believe occurred out here at Nelson, which was rather a strange one. He was a little psychic all his life, and I think this was while he was doing line work. And one of his linemen was shocked and appeared to be dead. He went into a complete state of coma. And my father got his men working on him, and they sent for the doctor, and the doctor came, and they pronounced him dead. But my father worked away for another 5 hours after the doctor pronounced this man dead, with artificial respiration. And he eventually brought this man to. And when the man came to, he said that he had been aware of everything that was said around him. He could hear and he could think, but he could not communicate. He could not move a muscle, and even his heart appeared to have stopped. But in any case, my father and the man that he had working with him, they took turns working on him. And at my father's insistence, he said, I know this man still has a spark of life. And they brought him around. And this occurred right here in this area. He had many wonderful adventures here, but the most colorful part of his life perhaps took place in Winnipeg. He was one of the city council on the board of control for 2 years. He was mayor during the big strike when everything went on strike. The police, the fire department, the bread and the milk, every factory went on strike. This was the big general sympathetic strike, which was proved by the mounted police to have been inspired by the Bolsheviks, but most of the people who were involved in it did not realize this. And this had a very detrimental effect upon business in Winnipeg for many years afterwards. But my father kept his head, and he managed to confine the strike to Winnipeg. And after 5 weeks, they had to call in the militia to help to break it. But at one point in the strike, they dared him to go to City Park and to speak to the strikers. And the then chief of police came to him and said, don't go, you will be killed, and all our special voluntary police will be killed, and it will all be on your head. And he said, I will go alone, I do not want your man. And he went with his chauffeur and his private secretary and with 2 or 3 friends, and he spoke to the crowd for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and part of that time they were cheering him, and part of the time they were calling for his blood. But at the end of the hour and 20 minutes, he said, how would you like to be me? He was discussing the 2 sides, the 2 factions that were involved. And the strike was over then, and it was over for a few days, but it flared up again. Eventually, they got it under control, and he was criticized because in the final day of the strike, when the strikers went out and knocked over a streetcar in the public square, and he had to read the Riot Act 3 times during that strike, he was criticized because he allowed the Mounties to use baseball bats. But I have often wondered what might have happened if the Mounties had been permitted to use anything stronger. He was very, very concerned and very upset about this, and when the strike was over, he was offered a lot of money to go on lecture tours through the States and other places talking about it. This he refused to do because he felt it was always a great tragedy. It was born of the sorrows of the working people, and it was instigated by people who were using them for other purposes, and it caused great sorrow. And so he would not make any money out of this, and he never did. But he was elected mayor the following year, and one of the, just about the time that he was to retire, just a month or 2 before he left the mayor's office, and he did not run again, he did something which made many people say that, oh, he was just angling to run again. At this time, apples were rotting on the orchards in Ontario, and probably out here too, and falling to the ground ungraded. And my father was always very fond of apples. He used to talk about the beautiful apples from around Nelson and the Kootenays. And so he organized the farmers in Ontario, and he brought in trainloads of apples to Winnipeg. And he had these apples sold at a very, very low price to everyone that wanted them. and they were advertised all over Winnipeg as Mayor Gray's apples. And there were a few people, of course, who profiteered on them and put the prices up, and they had to be hauled into court and reprimanded. But he broke the price of apples in Winnipeg for many years with this particular thing. And I can remember as a small child going down to the railway yards, and the apples were just taken away in sacks and in boxes, and they were brought in carloads, just the way you brought in coal. And this was one of the things he did. Well, later on, after he was mayor, he became very interested in the natural resources of Canada. I think he was always interested in them. In the gold mining in northern Manitoba. And he got his friends together, and he became the first president of the Onto the Bay Association. The Onto the Bay caused the completion of the Hudson's Bay Railroad from mile 214 right up to Churchill. My father wrote the brief, went to Ottawa at his own expense, and he presented the brief to Mackenzie King, and got the charter through. And Mackenzie King sent out a message to Charlie Gray, and he said this was the finest brief he had ever heard. Well, of course, he put into it the romance, the vision which he had of the natural resources in that area opening up. And he could see it as an engineer and as a sailor. He used to say that Churchill would one day be a great commercial port and an important military base, and he was laughed at and lampooned because of this. And later on, when the charter went through and the railroad was built, this was the thing that he was most proud of. But he worked for about 10 years onto the bay, and a year after the charter went through, then he retired from that, and he went on to doing other things for Canada, and he went to England and Florida and for a while. And then later we returned to Winnipeg, and he formed, quite by accident, the Cutty Sark Club. The Cutty Sark Club is a club group of old sailors, and you had to have served your time in sail in order to belong. And it is still flourishing in Winnipeg. The last time I was there, Bill Fawcett, the purser, put his arms around me, and he said, "We are keeping this club going in loving memory of Charlie Gray, who was the inspiration that started it." And if you go to Winnipeg, if you go to the Cutty Sark Club rooms in the Winnipeg Free Press building, you will see about 40 of the most beautiful models of old sailing ships that you will find anywhere in the world today. And some of the most famous seamen in the world are members of the Cutty Sark and honorary members of it. And then my father came back to British Columbia during the war in 1941. He came out to run an Epsom salt mine and refinery in Ashcroft. This was part of the war effort. The Epsom salt was used not for the purpose which springs to mind, but in tanning leather, and was important to the war effort. In 1943, the family moved down to Victoria, where my father was semi-retired, and he sold life insurance until he was not well enough to do so, and he eventually passed away in Victoria. But just before he died, he did something which I think was the nicest finale he could have had. His sailing ship, when he first ran away to sea, not the one he ran away to sea on, but the one he was apprenticed to as a young midshipman, was called the Arunzi. She was a four-masted iron clipper ship. And in 1954, just before he died, he and my mother were invited to go on board the Orient liner, the Arunzi. So they went over to Vancouver, went on board her, saw all over this magnificent ship, and this was on the 7th of June, 1954. He came back to Victoria on the 17th after having a lovely holiday in Vancouver, and he passed away on the 27th of June. Now, he was always a little psychic, and he told my daughter about 6 weeks before he died, he said, "You know, the machine is getting very tired, and I'm not able to do much more for my family or for my country." And he said, "Very soon now, I think I will leave my body and I will go on to a voyage, a great voyage into more high adventure and a crown." And so when my father, Charlie Gray, died, I don't think anyone excepting my mother cried until the funeral, because we all felt that he had gone on another voyage and another great adventure. We cried at the funeral as you do when you wave goodbye to someone, when you say bon voyage to a very great and very wonderful soul. And we were brought up on three things: on the sea, a love of the sea and the adventure and the beauty of it, and on the natural resources of Canada, and to believe in the Lord Almighty. And I never did find out which came first, but I know that his love of the natural resources of Canada had its inception and its beginning right here in Nelson, when he worked at the smelter and saw the beautiful scenery here and worked in the mines. And our attic at home as children was full of samples of quartz, some of which, I think, came from this beautiful Kootenay district. This is Avis Walton, now living in Victoria, British Columbia, and speaking to you from Nelson.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Walton. I'm sure that this will be of great interest to the people in the Kootenays. Hello, folks. This is Ross Fleming of Fleming Recordings in Nelson, and I have the pleasure today of welcoming Mrs. Avis Walton. That's her maiden name, her own name, and I also have Mr. Paddy Walton here, from whom we will hear later in regard to their present experiences, and Mrs. Walton about her memory of the old times when her father was a resident of Nelson back in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, it's always a pleasure to have with us descendants of our old timers. As you know, our old timers are getting rather scarce, and it behoves the younger generation to carry on with some of the stories that have been missed with our old timers. And it is a pleasure to have Mrs. Walton here today, as her father was an early resident of Nelson, worked in the smelter, in the old Hull mine smelter, and had experiences in the neighborhood of Nelson. So we will ask Mrs. Walton now to give her impressions about what she has heard about the early days in Nelson, and also about her present residence in Victoria. Mrs. Walton, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Fleming. Actually, my husband has been in Nelson before, but this is my very first trip here, and fortunately our car broke down. That may sound a little peculiar, but we had some trouble with the car, and so we have been here for a couple of days instead of just whizzing through in a matter of hours. And I was very interested in talking to you today and in going into your public library and rambling around a little and trying to get some of the atmosphere that my father used to tell me about. And of course, we did another interview specifically on my father's work at the smelter here and at Bonnington Falls, and later on coming back with the Westinghouse to help to install equipment for the West Kootenay Light and Power on behalf of the Westinghouse. But I think that since we did that interview, you have driven my husband and I about, and I would like to really talk to you now as a member of the tourist trade group of the Chamber of Commerce of the City of Victoria.
That'll just be fine.
I went to Victoria some years ago and worked for 6 years on the Times, the daily newspaper, and then started a service of welcoming new residents. As an outgrowth of this, I wrote a small booklet of 80 pages dealing with all the kinds of questions which newcomers ask when they arrive in the city. And from this developed a book on Victoria. So I became very interested in the history of Victoria and Vancouver Island, and I'm also rather interested in the history of the entire province. You know, when I was in school as a youngster, I loved English history. I even enjoyed American history, but Canadian history was presented in such a frightfully dull fashion. And it wasn't until I came to live in Ashcroft in British Columbia that I suddenly realized that we had a lot of really colorful and exciting people in our own history. And I learned about Caribou Cameron and the Jones Company, and Scottish Jenny, who rode horseback like a man and was finally killed, being thrown from a horse and having her neck broken. And I've had several trips around this country. I've been up to Barkerville and looked at the old area there and scrambled around in the snow looking at the gravestones and the headstones. And I don't know, maybe one day I'll do a guidebook about the whole province. But the one that I have done on Victoria seems to please people. I think it's partly because, you know, Victoria is the only place on the North American continent that is laughed at and also laughs at itself. We have an awful lot of interesting characters about. We have a great many authorities because Victoria is essentially a truly cosmopolitan city. It's cosmopolitan in the sense that people wear what they please, they do what they please, and they say what they please, more or less, as long as they're not offending their neighbors. And people come to retire to Victoria from all over the world. We have experts. You name a subject and we've got an expert on it. Once when I was doing interviews and lining up people to be interviewed on CBC, I remember going up to Duncan, for example, and talking to old Major Rattery. Now, he is an expert on soil conservation, on riverbank conservation, and on fish conservation. And I wanted him to go over to the CBC in Vancouver, and he said that he would not expose himself to the horrors of going to a big city like Vancouver if the CBC wanted to send their equipment down into his garden, that he would be very pleased to grant them an interview. He was a wonderful old man. And I went around and saw old Colonel Doppington Heppenstall. And what was the name of the fellow, Paddy, who has the market garden stand just outside of Duncan on the north side of the road? The naval commander?
I've forgotten, I'm afraid.
Commander...
Windeer, isn't it?
Yes. Commander Windeer is one of the characters on the island. He is extremely interested in organic gardening, and he claims to have the biggest organic gardening market stall in Canada west of Toronto. And he's an expert on judo. He speaks Japanese. And he was one of our heroes. What was his story, Paddy, with convoying ships in the Atlantic?
I don't think I ever actually heard that story. Just a rumor.
Well, it was written up in Maclean's magazine. And he convoyed a very big number of ships across the Atlantic. A number were lost, but they lost most of their escort. Their escort was diverted to some other area at that point, and they had to. They had a really ghastly crossing, but he did some things for which he won great recognition. He's one of our #1 Canadian war heroes. But when you meet him these days, he's generally dressed in old blue jeans and a grubby old shirt, and he's out in his compost heaps nursing his strawberries along, and believe me, they're beautiful. But we do have people like this on the island, and my little book deals with some of the anecdotes and history and background. And I wonder if I might tell you a little bit about the book plate in the front. When I say that one of the things which has made it go rather well has been the anecdotes and the nonsense, this little book plate is drawn up, and it says, "This book about Victoria and Vancouver Island is fondly cherished by the possessor," and there's a space left for the name of the person who owns it, "as a nostalgic reminder of a leisurely, lovely island set in a sparkling sea, blessed with many beauties and strange Anglo-Saxon customs. If you do not return this book to its rightful owner, may you be haunted forever by nightmarish visions of cricket without tea, tea without crumpets, and be doomed to that shameful purgatory reserved in the nether regions for inveterate booktomaniacs." Now, of course, this is a bit of nonsense, and Paddy dreamed up the word booktomaniacs for me. I was trying to fish for something which would describe people that take your books and never return them. And we take a lot of kidding in Victoria about tea and cricket, and everything stops for tea.
And the birds?
And
Follow the birds of Victoria?
yes, well, follow the birds to Victoria. Even I have managed to work on that one a little bit. You know, my name is Avis, which is the Latin for bird.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm one of the birds that perhaps you'd like to follow back to Victoria. We have in the early days, we've had some very interesting characters in Victoria. If you wander around Bastion Square, for example, you'll see the old Burns House Hotel, where the Chinese ladies of a certain kind of business used to put their heads out the door there. There was a round hole in the door, and this particular young Chinese girl put her head out the door soliciting business out this round hole, and she had a friend down the way who was in the butcher business, and he didn't like her having dealings with other men, so he came along one day and sliced her head off. There are some more entertaining anecdotes about Victoria. I know in the early days, and this of course applied in Nelson, when a man took a woman out for a walk 100 years ago in Victoria, which is actually, this is our centennial year. When he took her out for a walk, he no doubt looked her over even more carefully than he does today, not so much in regard to her measurements, which seem to have got into the news an awful lot in the last few years, but in regard to her actual weight, because he was expected to pick a lady up and carry her across the muddy roads. And there were some very interesting people. One of our interesting people in Victoria about 80 or 90 years ago was F.M. Rattenbury. Now, Mr. Rattenbury came from London. At the age of 23, he won the commission to build our Parliament buildings, to design and build them. He was the architect. Later, he designed the Empress Hotel and the offices down at the CPR dock. And this is why when you sail into the harbour at Victoria, you get such a feeling of continuity and empathy. And Rattenbury returned to London. He was murdered in Bournemouth by a man who was in love with his wife. And so this is another of the stories from Victoria. But we were remarking here yesterday, my husband was saying about your buildings around here. We noticed the style of your architecture is consistent. We like the feeling, although many of your homes are old, they belong here. They look as though they were built for the contours of the land. And this is a very nice thing. You don't see this in many Canadian cities. What do you think about this, Paddy?
Well, I noticed that a good many of the older houses, in fact, practically all, are in very nice condition, that they're very well maintained and painted up, and they look as though somebody really loved them. You don't find this in most other towns as you go about, and I think it's a very admirable thing. Another point I would like to make in passing is that what with the new highways coming this way and the attractions of this area, there are some good opportunities for somebody in the motel business. You seem to have relatively very few compared to the other medium-sized towns. And I think there's quite a future here in this thing.
Well, thank you very much, Paddy. That it's just points like that really bring the necessity of this district to our attention.
I feel too that you could make far greater use of your very beautiful stone here. Did I mention that before?
No, just in passing.
You have it on some of your shops, but I would like to see, as a local Chamber of Commerce project here, if your Chamber of Commerce and your local merchants could be interested in facing almost all the stores on your main streets with some of your local slate or quartz or stone or your gold-bearing marble, that this would, in time, you'd get a feeling of continuity, even if the architecture of the buildings were in a variety of styles. If you could use a lot of this stone on your main street, I think this would become a talking point among the tourists, and I don't imagine it would be very expensive to do, would it, Mr. Fleming?
No, I don't think so, because a lot of this stone is procurable locally and can be got just by simply going out to the mountains and getting it.
And,
thanks very much.
And you see, people come to Victoria because it's known as a little bit of old England, or Follow the Birds, or the Garden City. Now, you could be a garden city. As Paddy has said, your gardens are lovely and your hanging baskets are very charming. And the whole feeling of the place is very, very nice indeed. This is a very sketchable town. I would like to bring my sister-in-law, Paddy Walton Packard, or some other artist here, and have them do nice line sketches, because you have so much that is most attractive to sketch. But your tourists coming in, contours of your land and your rock, some focal point of the whole thing that you can advertise in about 2 words, perhaps the town of the gold quartz, or the golden town, or the mining town, whatever it is. If this stone were used to point up not only the beauty of the rock and to make the town itself look prettier, but to give you a springboard for advertising as the mining centre, or a mining centre in the Kootenays. Perhaps I'm not putting it too well, but you see what I mean?
Yes, I think that's quite understandable.
And we have enjoyed just being here and seeing your magnificent scenery and your beautiful river. I'd like to stick around longer until the weather were a little warmer so I could try some of your outdoor pools, because we rather like swimming. At home we have a rather interesting house which Paddy took apart and stuck together again. It has I think it's called a cathedral type ceiling, an open ceiling in the living room, at least a peaked ceiling, and he has added some lovely beams in the dining room, and The house is a little unique, but we have made good use of local things there. And outdoors we built our own swimming pool with the help of lots of friends and neighbors. And it belongs to the land too. We're on Mount Talmy, and we have several terraces and a smaller pool for goldfish and a lower one which we used to use for the children to wade in before they could swim. And we also belong to the Theatre Guild in Victoria. Paddy has been on the board there off and on for some time. We're very interested in dramatics. And yesterday when we went down to the courthouse and sat there and listened to some of the tragic story of the Doukhobors, tragic, I think, both from their point of view and your point of view and the whole history of Canada. It's a shame that this cannot be solved, but it's terribly complex. But I stood on your lower street where the Civic Theatre and the library is and looked up to your hills with all the lights twinkling in these lovely houses that seem to go on, sometimes 2, 3, and even 4 stories of them. What a marvelous backdrop this would make for a theatrical sometime, for a play based on some of your history or some of the things which go on here.
Very good suggestion.
I have fiddled around and written some children's plays, and Paddy has done lighting. Didn't you think that from a lighting point of view alone, this was an interesting thing last night, Paddy?
This is quite lovely looking out over the city. And very few cities nowadays or ever have such a view where you can go up in the park on the east end of the town and look back over on a panorama. And this, I think, has been, the advantage has been taken of this very well.
You might even advertise Nelson as a city with a sparkling golden night panorama and a daytime decor of your lovely quartz and rock and slate, which is gold-bearing and copper-bearing and rich in minerals and so forth. All this, there might be some way of tying this together in promoting Nelson as being a rather unique city. And you do have to have a central theme. I expect you have one now, and I'm really talking out of turn.
Okay.
But just seeing it for the first time as a stranger, and of course realizing that my own father came here originally because of the gold. I suppose all that has an influence, but I think that you could use the term gold in your advertising to tourists. And I do hope that someday we'll be able to come back and prowl around a little more in your museum and your library. And incidentally, if you have any listeners who happened to know my father, Charlie Gray, when he was 17 or 19 or about 22 in this area way back long ago, I'd like very much to hear from them. He was not terribly tall, about 5'9" or 10. He had chestnut curly hair at that time and rather attractive brown eyes. And he got into a lot of things, I'm sure, because he had a lovely singing voice, and he would have sung a few sea shanties in some of these charming old houses that are still here set in your hillside. And we do wish both Paddy and I to thank you so much for driving us around and showing us your lovely city today, Mr. Fleming.
You're very, very welcome, and it's been a great pleasure to have met you. And I'm sure that your remarks will be an inspiration to a good many people around Nelson, and it'll certainly be publicized.
We're now going to charge up to Nakusp as fast as we can get there to see Paddy's brother Jeff. Jeff is in the building business up there, and he has come down to Victoria many times with the most beautiful slides of the Arrow Lakes and the Kootenays and so on. So now we're going to go up there and tell him that we have seen the inspiration for his lovely slides, and thank you.
Thank you very much.